I've been a palliative care clinician for 12 years, and I think what really made me interested in research is palliative care is a really rapidly evolving discipline, and I think that's what attracted me to the clinical area in terms of being able to actually shape a discipline that is quite young. And it really then became obvious to me that there was areas of practice where there was a lot of treatments that we didn't actually know what was best, or we could actually do a lot better. And I think it was when I did some training outside palliative care in oncology, where research is much more integrated into clinical practice, and I was working with Paul and his team, that I really thought that, actually in palliative care we needed clinicians who were doing similar things and actually applying an inquiring mind into the treatment and interventions that they offered, and actually trying to accelerate that. So I figured I needed to do that, and then I realised that a lot of clinician researchers do a little project here and a little project there, and they sort of make it up as they go along, and then in 20 years' time they've done 7 audits or 7 case series, and really I didn't see that that was a way that we were really going to progress palliative care quite rapidly, and I figured I needed some people to help me work out how to do clinical research. And so I enrolled in a PhD because I knew then my supervisors would actually have to sign on the dotted line and actually help me and be invested in the process, and I don't think I was really actually that concerned whether I got a PhD at the end. It took me 8 years. I was working full time. And I think one of the issues for me was I said yes to everything. So within 2 years of being a specialist, I found myself running a tertiary palliative care unit. And so I was being an administrator and clinician and doing my PhD part-time with young children. But I think it really then meant the PhD was one element of that. It gave me a structure, guidance and a direction, and I think that guidance in terms of where a clinician researcher pathway was going to take me came along the way, because I sought opportunities to actually try and work alongside people who were taking that journey but maybe a few steps ahead of me. And I think what I really thought of put on my slides was, what is it really that makes me passionate about clinical research? I think especially in palliative care I've really found that it gives our patients a voice. And there is a lot of things about living with advanced illness that is really hard to portray to other clinicians, other researchers and the community. And I think my role as a clinician researcher is to give a platform for those people's voices to be heard and taken notice of. I think in palliative care a culture of inquiry really has had tangible benefits beyond the research itself, and I think in any clinical area that also holds true. And I think we can do research on questions that are really public interest, and a lot of the research we do, no one else is invested in actually wanting to answer that question. And I think clinicians inherently are then very passionate about the questions that they're taking forward in research, and that's part of the success of the research that they do, is because they're really trying to make a true difference to their patients. And I think the other thing is then when you have a really bad day and you think this study is really not going anywhere, I'm really thinking that I'm going to quit, sure enough you'll go down onto the ward, and the person that you will see, the first person that you will have randomly decided to start at that end of the word, they will have the condition for which your study is all about, and you think, okay, better keep beavering along. And I was doing a clinical trial in Delirium, which you have to consent people through their proxy, and delirium is quite an acute medical problem, so trying to consent someone for a clinical trial when they're seriously unwell and you're consenting the decision maker is not for the faint-hearted. And I think probably it was about 5 or 6 times I really thought, I'm just going to quit this study, I'll find someone else to take over. And sure enough, you go down to the ward and you'll see 5 patients with delirium, and you think, okay, it's much worse for them than it is for me, who's just sort of whinging about why this study is difficult. And I think the other thing is you can follow your research from the idea to actually doing the research, then going back into practice and thinking, how can we use this to shape what we do? And I think that whole circle and being able to be part of all of that is really rewarding. I think another thing is that it gives you a shared language to tackle clinical problems. You get to meet people who you, as just a clinician, you would probably not actually talk to. And you can then share an interest to solve particular issues. And I think our health systems are really crying out for people from really diverse backgrounds to get together and solve these challenging issues. I think I've built better clinical relationships through engagement through research. So I now talk to people who, I think if I just said, I'm a palliative care clinician, I want you to help me with this, it would have been hard to really foster those meaningful long-term relationships and articulate the cause for change, especially in a field where there's a lot of misconceptions and misperceptions about what we do and what we're trying to achieve. And I think research really has given us a platform to say, we're thinking about the issues in the same way that you're thinking about your clinical issues. So I'll use the example, a lot of my research has been around delirium and cognition, and I think curiosity at the bedside is really what I think defines a clinical researcher. It really was mysterious to me how we could have been using antipsychotics for decades without a single randomised controlled trial in delirium at all, let alone cancer. And then I realised they're actually very cheap and the trials are really difficult, and maybe that's probably why no one has bothered to do the trial. Yet 1 in 3 people with advanced cancer may have an episode of delirium, and so it just was crying out for a clinician really to take that challenge on. In the literature, the patient voice was really that mental awareness at the end of life was so fundamentally important, and if you put the two things together, it really gives a driver for why that research is important. And then I went out and tried to find people who did research in delirium and care for people with delirium. And so I now have colleagues in aged care psychiatry, in geriatrics, in pharmacology, in the cell biology lab. And really, I think delirium is a good example that it belongs to no one, yet all of these disciplines really have a role to play. And then once we actually finished our trial, we were able then to think about the policy and how that really needed to change in terms of delirium care, and now palliative care is included in the delirium clinical standards released by the Safety and Quality Commission last year. And so I think that whole cycle from seeing why it was important to patients, doing the research, and then being able to go back and say, how can we actually change what we do, is really what's rewarding when you're working in clinical research. And I think really what we're doing is trying to understand how we can do things better. And I think the drivers for us is that for our patients, it's not optional, the things that they're experiencing and the outcomes that they want. And the research we do is often very hard. We're tackling questions that often no one else wants to, or there's no imperative from a funding point of view to do. But I think when we're working in the clinical environment, it's always harder for our patients than it is for us to do the research.